First, I would like to look at migration from China to Korea. And hopefully, towards the end of it, you'll be able to discuss the influence of Chinese migrants on Korea at least a little bit. But there's still a lot to explore because I can only focus on a few items. So please read more and explore that relationship. So another question to consider throughout this is what role migrants play in cultural exchange. Migrants are different from tourists, of course, and they come with a different view of in what you might call target country. So what's the effect of the migrants in cultural exchange versus perhaps tourists? I'd also like to point out that there's some beautiful things to consider in all of this as well, and of course food is among them. And here you have 4 dishes. They're all different, but they have some commonalities. So jiajiangmian is the one in the top left corner. It's a dish served in Beijing, and it is in some ways similar, but in many ways also different from jjajangmyeon, which is the Korean version served in Seoul. It's an adapted version that became very popular. In the bottom left corner, you see jjampong, which is a Japanese dish, and then somehow this dish that was served in Seoul based on a kind of Chinese kind of development, something that the Chinese made with the ingredients that they had, it somehow reminded them of that. So the Japanese called it jampong, and that term persisted, even though they're very different dishes. And as you can see, jampong in a way looks a bit like the French bouillabaisse. So it's a fish soup. In this case, a very spicy fish soup. So since the latter half of the 1800s, Chinese have migrated to Korea, not in large numbers, in small numbers at first, but they mostly migrated from the part in China that is closest to Korea, which is the Shandong area, the area where you also find Qingdao, most kind of best known for Qingdao beer. And so this is the area, if you look at the map, that really is sticking out a little bit towards the Korean peninsula. And so it's kind of logical that a lot of Chinese would come from there, and they did. So they have mostly come from there and settled in Korea, in the big cities, so Seoul and Incheon, Busan and Wonsan at the time. Of course, there are other big cities, but these are the main ones. Chinese eventually have come to represent the largest number of foreign residents in Korea. So in 2021, they represented roughly 43% of foreign migrants in Korea. So there's roughly 5 periods in which or during which the Chinese have come to Korea, and it started roughly in the, I believe it's the mid-1880s, when the Korean government asked the Qing government for help dealing with aggressive Japanese, and so the Chinese government then sent roughly 4,000 soldiers and some kind of associated people to the Korean peninsula, and they would stay for a while, and then after that you see that they start to develop trade, so they keep coming back to Korea. And of course the numbers aren't great, but it's certainly an important starting point for kind of the migration of people to Korea, of Chinese to Korea. During the colonial period, which you could call a second period, even though it's connected, none of these periods is isolated in any way. But the colonial period is interesting too, in that the Chinese actually were very effective in trade with Korea. And at some point towards the late 30s, they actually owned pretty much a third of all import trade in Korea. And of course they became, in that sense, they became strong competitors for the Japanese colonial authorities, who then put out some legislation that made the profit of the Chinese very difficult. So they, the taxes they applied brought down the trade considerably just prior to liberation. But then after liberation, trade and migration starts to increase again, with about 17,000 Chinese eventually ending up in Korea around the, I think around the late 50s. So roughly that number. And then in 1955 until 1990, partly because of developments in China and also the Korean government's relationship with China, the number stagnates and actually starts to drop. And so from 1955 to 1990, the number of Chinese coming to Korea to really live here permanently actually decreases until 1990, when after the Cold War, the number starts to increase again. And so that now has led to a large number of Chinese becoming interested again, because it's much easier to do so. And some people, of course, those with a Korean background in particular, may have an additional, in a sense, feat that they can bring to the table when looking for employment, for example. With Chinese trade being so important to Korea, of course, speaking Chinese is a major asset if you speak basic Korean, but if you speak fluent Korean, of course, that's even better. The problem is, of course, that as most people know, is that Koreans don't always look that kindly on Chinese migrants. And that's unfair, and a lot of Koreans think this is unfair too. But it's just something that happens, and it happens everywhere. People around the world always look a bit negative at migrants. And Australia, where I live, this is a major issue as well. And so there's a number of movies where Korean Chinese are portrayed in a rather negative way, as though they are always closer to crime than other people, even though that's unfair. And if you look at the figures, actually the crime rate amongst Korean Chinese in Korea is much lower than that of, let's say, regular Koreans without that background in China. But even so, in movies they are often portrayed as the criminal. Not all movies, but a fair number of rather popular movies like Hwanghae, for example, Yellow Sea. There's also a number of Chinese celebrities now in Korea, and so that may also boost the kind of representation of Chinese in Korea. So there's K-pop stars from China. Miss A is a good example, where you have Chinese idols, in a sense, portraying China. Some of them, of course, also come from Taiwan. I guess one of the issues that especially Korean Chinese also face here in Korea is the sense of homeland. but it also applies to people from Shandong who settled here, because we're no longer speaking about the second generation or third. Some of them may be fourth generation or even more than that. And they may still feel that they are not getting kind of the respect they deserve, and they may still feel rather foreign, which may be because of developments in mainland China, but the notion of homeland still is an issue to many migrants, including adoptees, but it certainly also applies to Chinese migrants. One interesting element that I've already mentioned earlier is, of course, food. The Chinese, of course, have wonderful food, just like Korea, but China is a big country, so they have a lot of varieties, and they have food that, especially when you travel north to the kind of Dongbei area of China, resembles Korean food quite a lot. Now, the Shandong area has slightly different food, though, from the food that is similar. It's a bit different, and in a way it uses less spice, for example, than Korean food. And yet over the years Chinese restaurants here in Korea have kind of really thrived because of a number of very popular Chinese dishes. And the most popular ones you see here, so it's jjajangmyeon and jjampong. There's a third one perhaps we should mention, and that's 탕수육. And actually, as I guess as a consumer, as an individual, I became familiar with these dishes first, not so much because of travel to Korea, but because I saw some of these dishes in movies or Korean dramas. And over the years, of course, I've also eaten the dishes, and I found that they are really quite Korean. They don't resemble Chinese food much at all. So they've really become localized dishes. One of the problems that Professor Kim Kwang-ok has pointed out is that Chinese restaurants all developed a rather similar style, and that towards the end of the 90s kind of made all the Chinese restaurants serve pretty much the same food, that all tasted the same. That's his argument. And that's also my experience, having come to Korea since the late 80s, is that the Chinese restaurants by the late 90s weren't very unique, and they did not seem to have regional specialties. Cantonese food somehow never really took off in Korea either, which is perhaps surprising because of the popularity of Cantonese food elsewhere in the world. And so yam cha or dim sum restaurants can be found everywhere in Australia, for example, but in Korea they're quite rare. There are a few, but they're still quite rare. Generally speaking, I think to Koreans, and this is also what scholars have pointed out, Koreans associate pure, genuine Chinese food as being, for example, the Peking duck. In the style of the north of Beijing. So not the kind of Guangdong, Guangzhou style, but the style from Beijing, which is different. So what we see now is that in areas like Incheon, but also in central Seoul, where you have this kind of street behind the central post office, which has a Chinese school as well, and has for a long time been this kind of centralized mini Chinatown, that the food there is becoming better and better and more popular. And so they have kind of become, in a sense, more authentic again. So they're trying to specialize. And this is a kind of a more recent development, that started, I think, in the 2000s. And if you go to Incheon as well, there's a proper Chinatown with a gate and everything, and the food there is also better than usual. And Koreans interested in more authentic Chinese food now go there to enjoy that food. And so it's interesting because you will be able to, of course, sample these very popular dishes there, but also many others. And so who knows, maybe in the future we will, in Korea, we will see even more Chinese dishes becoming localized. And they may end up in Korean movies and Korean dramas. So to summarize, here's a couple of keywords. So we have Chinese residents from Taiwan in Korea as well. That's a fair number, but most of the people originally come from the Shandong area in China. And then I think one important thing is that the prejudices have long lingered towards people from China. It seems to be much better these days, although of course the political relationship with China isn't always a very easy one. Even so, I think the impression that people have of the Chinese migrants seems to be improved compared to in the past, which is a good development.